On this episode of Life in a Tide Pool, find out why stinging cells of sea anemones don't harm humans, what other forms of life are living inside the bodies of sea anemones, and how certain sea anemones wage war on others of the same species. Good morning, everyone. My name is Casey Eunice, and today we're going to explore the tide pools at Dyke Rock, California. Now, you might be wondering, this is not Dyke Rock, and there are no tide pools here. But we're standing in the gallery of the Birch Aquarium at the Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla, California. The aquarium is a premier aquarium on the West Coast that has hundreds of exhibits. It also has many public programs. So one of the programs we're going to go on is the Tide Pool Adventure. We're actually going to accompany an aquarium staff member who's going to tell us all about the tide pool at Dyke Rock. So if you're ready, let's go. The Dyke Rock tide pools are located several hundred yards north of the pier at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography and just down the road from the aquarium. The tide pools are composed of a large boulder fields with a single larger rock outcropping. This larger rock outcropping rises several feet above the boulder fields and makes a perfect habitat for marine animals and plants to attach to. I met with Daniel Beckwith from the aquarium and joined him on a fascinating tour of these tide pools. We found this one area in particular that had some huge sea anemones. I was walking along this area and I saw these little tube snails, or these animals living in a tube. What are these?
Yeah, so a lot of the time you'll see these kind of whitish, yellowish shells hanging out on these rocks. These are actually tube worms.
Gotcha.
So there's worms living inside there, and you'll notice they kind of are facing outward. So inside there's this little animal who filter feeds. It's basically a worm with these long feathery-like things around its mouth. It can grab food, small things that drift by, and pull it back into its protective shell.
All right, so I see them on the different undersides of rocks, probably low in the water area, right?
Yeah, so these animals have gills. They need the water to get the dissolved oxygen to breathe. So really low in the water here where there's plenty of water all the time. So if you kind of look at this rock here, you actually can see there's different zones here. This is the wet zone, obviously.
Right, yes.
These animals are wet all the time, but these are animals that are really hardy. They're the ones who are spray zone, kind of the high tide zone. They're only wet when the tide comes up as high as it possibly can.
So when you mean the tide zones, we actually can see kind of different zones here. I have algae, and then I've got mussels and barnacles, and then up over here we actually see the smaller barnacles, right?
Yeah, so you've got the spray zone, which probably gets the least amount of water, and as you kind of go down, you see there's more and more critters are appearing because this is what they need, is the water. But these are the ones that can survive out of the water for longer periods of time. But they're going to decrease as they kind of go up where the tide goes.
Gotcha. So a lot of different types of animals we'd see in this type of rock,
exactly,
in the other parts that we saw over there, right?
Yeah.
All right. So again, the wet zone, a lot more wave action.
A lot more wave action, yeah.
So I think the tide is starting to come in quite a bit.
Yes.
So let's go ahead and go back to the aquarium and look at the touch tank.
Sounds fantastic.
Okay. The Dyke Rock tide pools are also located very near a popular hang gliding area. Notice the many hang gliders in this background. The Birch Aquarium also has hundreds of exhibits that show many of the local habitats. It also has a large touch tank and tide pool area that is ideal for visitors to learn more about animals found in our local tide pools. So let's, I noticed some other great marine life in here. Tell us about this one that I see right in front of me.
Yeah, so this thing that has all those tentacles sticking out doesn't look like much, but that is an animal, not a plant.
Right.
This is a sea anemone. And this is one of the solitary anemones, so they live by themselves rather than large groups. And our tide pools are kind of speckled with them all over the place. And right now that one's a little curled up. So maybe it's hungry, maybe it's not having a good time, but typically these guys are brilliant and out and all the tentacles are moving around.
All right. So here's a great question for you. Can the anemones move around?
If they really need to or want to, yes, they can move around. They're not stuck in one place. They have a big sort of, almost like a big muscular foot in the bottom. If they have to move, they will move either to find food or if they're being predated upon.
So Danny, tell me what a typical day like is for you here at the aquarium.
So it's hard to call it a typical day. It changes every day. Okay. But in terms of what I do, we have school programs that come in, and I might help with those programs. I might sit at my desk, work on designing curriculum, working with my colleagues on coming up with new ideas of teaching and learning with our guests. We also have floor programs, which I absolutely love doing, where we go out onto the floor and we have these kind of pop-up stations where guests can interact with us and solve critical thinking problems and have a deeper kind of experience rather than just looking at our exhibits sometimes.
Right. What are some of the great questions some of your visitors ask you during the Touch Tank and some of your other programs?
Yeah, so some of the great questions that we have here, most people don't realize a lot of this is just alive. Almost everything in here is alive. They think that it's either not living or, you can't touch it. Can you touch this thing? Is that thing safe to touch? What is that thing?
Right.
You can just see sometimes how excited they get just by this new experience here, and it's just fun to get those very simple questions.
So this is a different part of the Touch Tanks that we're looking over here, and I see a couple of different more animals over here.
Yep.
So again, I see more of the anemones, some of these big anemones over here, right?
Yeah, they get fairly huge, and we've got plenty of them scattered throughout our entire tide pool.
Now these are just what we're calling the solitary anemones. We
Right.
don't see some of the aggregating anemones out.
Right, yeah, these are much larger, living by themselves, spread apart. They get plenty of food here, so there's no reason for them to be bunched together to compete for food.
Right, you're talking about that. So the purple urchin down there.
Yeah.
So how many of these do you have in the tank? Do you have a lot of them? Or?
We have quite a few in here. They typically hide. As you can see, this one is eventually going to hide here.
Yes.
But we probably have probably 10 in here or more. We have another species of urchin in here as well.
So what's the other species that
We
you
have a red urchin in here, which is much larger than these small purple ones.
That right over there.
That right over there.
So that looks
right.
like one of the big red urchins we have.
Yeah, it's the ones people tend to think of when you think of urchin.
Right. Now, before we actually get too much further in the Touch Tank area, so what are some of the rules and regulations that you tell your visitors how to enjoy the Touch Tank?
Yeah, so when guests are invited to touch the animals in here, we do ask them to use 1 or 2 fingers.
Okay.
It's a great, easy way to feel the animal without harming the animal in any way. If they'd like to see an animal closer up or they like to touch it, they can ask a volunteer or a staff member to actually remove the animal, and we can actually look at it in a smaller tank so they can get an up-and-close personal encounter with that animal.
I see. So could you go ahead and pick up that urchin?
Yeah.
Let's see what these like.
So I'll take him out just for a little. This is a little purple sea urchin.
Okay.
Take him out just for a moment. So you can see here, he actually has food on him. That's the sea lettuce that he's probably going to be
Right
eating.
there.
Yep, right here.
And so they actually have the 2 feet come up, right?
Yeah.
Grab that and they move it where?
They can actually move it right down here to where their mouth is.
Right there.
This has a really fun name. This is Aristotle's lantern. So they have 5
It's not a
teeth.
light, right?
Not a light, right. It's actually their mouth that's buried on the bottom there.
Okay.
So they'll eventually use their 2 feet to move that around.
So I see another really very interesting creature, marine animal right over there. The
Yes.
big, long, orange thing. What is that?
Doesn't look like much. That's actually a sea cucumber. So the cousin to the sea urchin and the sea star.
All right. So what do the sea cucumbers eat?
Sea cucumbers, they're kind of like recyclers of the ocean. They will eat pretty much anything they can find on the bottom of the ocean. So we can take a closer look at these guys.
Yeah, that'd be great.
You can see here he's kind of bunching up into a ball.
Right,
And if you touch him very gently, he's very squishy, unlike a sea urchin or a sea star.
right.
And on the very bottom here, he has all those little tiny
yeah,
tube
look at
feet
that.
as well.
So is that how he moves around?
That's how he moves around, yeah.
And so that's how the urchins move around. and
Yeah,
things
so
like
all the echinoderms have these tube feet that are filled with water, which eventually allow them to crawl around on the ocean floor. And they can move pretty quick if they so desire.
The Rich Aquarium has many great exhibits, both indoor and outdoor, for visitors to see. I had the great opportunity to tour the aquarium with Sherry Knox and hear all about the aquarium and some of the exhibits that feature sea anemones.
With different habitats in those areas.
So this represents what is actually under the water in those areas like this, right?
Yes.
So much colder water. I see a lot of anemones and the rockfish here.
Yeah, so it's nutrient rich, so there's a lot of filter feeders that get nutrients from the water.
Okay.
And we have more over here. We like to point out the anemones and the wolf eels that we have here that are not true eels, but these were born here at the aquarium.
Oh yeah. There's 3 or 4 of them in here.
Yes, yes, and they mate for life.
And so this is a little bit, you said warmer water, you said?
No, this is still up
This
in
is
the
still up in
nutrient-rich
nutrient-rich
cold waters.
water.
Yes.
Okay.
And, well, just off San Diego, the ocean gets pretty deep, and so we have some small big eye octopus that were collected by our scientists at Scripps.
Oh, wow. So I see the little purple, tiny little anemones in here, right?
Those are strawberry anemones.
Ah, and those are actually right off our coast here.
Yes, yes.
And this?
This is also from our offshore depths, and you'll see tube anemones in here, And the really exciting thing in here are basket stars. See the basket star there in the back? They
Oh,
are,
yeah.
because they're from deep water, they're very rarely shown in aquariums.
Yeah, so deep water, a couple thousand feet,
Yes.
couple hundred feet.
Yes, we're 1,000 feet.
Okay.
And here we start our jelly exhibit. We have moon jellies and other jellies found around the world, not just locally. And you know, these are the ones that don't sting, so they're kind of safe.
Now, do you capture these or do you breed these here at the aquarium?
We capture them and we breed them. We're very successful in breeding them, and when we have extras, then we trade them for things with other aquariums.
Oh, it's got a little barter system.
Yes,
you got going
yes,
on.
exactly.
Okay, Sherry, what's this?
These are sea nettles. These are found right here off San Diego, and
So-
they are stinging jellies.
Yeah, these are the bad guys, right?
Yes,
so in the summertime or whenever they sting you, you get the really bad rashes.
Yes, and they can get a bell that's 3 feet across.
Wow. Now, why are they continually moving here in circulation?
Well, they do in the wild. They don't really have their own propellant system,
Right.
and so there's a little bit of a current in here, and they just float along with the current.
Okay.
And these are some red striped jellies. They're found in warm water near Japan. These are comb jellies, and if you can see them up close, they're very cool because they have little cilia that make it look like a rainbow when they are swimming.
And these all have that little the color, the flashes of color along the
Yes,
side.
yes.
Yes, I've seen those over here. Okay.
And these are our upside down jellies. They look like they're kind of confused, don't they?
They do, like they're sitting on their head. What's up with that?
That's just what they do for a living.
Really?
Yep.
Huh.
And then you can see the little babies in the tank at the top.
Over the top, that's right. Okay.
And these are lagoon jellies. These are also non-stinging, and they live in freshwater lakes in Palau. You can go swimming with them.
I'm not sure I want to go swimming, so they don't sting. Or do
They don't.
sting? Okay. I wanted to learn a little bit more about the symbiotic relationship that sea anemones have with algae. So I went to visit my colleague Bruno Pernay at the lab to learn more. So Bruno, one of the first things I want to know, what's the classification of an anemone?
Well, they are in a group of animals that are called cnidarians, and that whole group of animals is named for a specific kind of cell that they have that produces a stinging organelle.
I see a couple of different anemones here, so what am I looking at here?
Well, these are both members of the genus Anthopleura. These are called sunflower anemones, sometimes Anthopleura sola. Both the same. You'll see these in the intertidal. This you'll see in the very low intertidal, or it's much more common in the subtidal. This is called a strawberry anemone.
Now, these over here, when we're walking in the tide pools, these are the ones that are kind of by themselves, and you
Yep.
see them in groups of addition like that over here. There's another one here that's not here, and it's the aggregating anemone, right?
Yeah.
So those we see in clumps.
Right, in aggregations, right? So those are close relatives of this, but they're much smaller. They get to maybe about that big around or something like
Right.
that, and you see them in these sheets that cover over boulders of tens or hundreds of individuals, and they get that way because they reproduce asexually, and they form these clones of sea anemones that cover the rock.
These cloning anemones over here, once they touch something from its not itself, came from another individual, we have some interesting interaction there, don't we?
Yeah, very exciting but very slow interactions. When a clone bumps up against a clone that's not of its same genetics, genotype, they'll often undergo these battles, basically, these very sort of slow motion battles that are sometimes deadly. And they do those battles with these little white structures that you can actually see on this anemone.
Oh,
here.
right here.
Yeah.
So what do we call that structure?
Those are called acrorrhagi, and they look sort of like very short, stubby tentacles that are really white in color. And what those are they're not actually tentacles like these are for feeding, but they're these little protrusible structures that are covered with a lot of those nematocysts, those stinging cells that we talked about earlier.
Do all cnidarians have this type of structure?
That's a great question. Well, most do, at least in some part of their life history, but there's lots of cnidarians also that live up in the water column that we call jellyfishes that have basically this kind of structure, but they're sort of upside down and drifting. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so these are very close relative of jellyfish, right?
They are.
Except these are sessile, living on the bottom.
Yep.
A lot of, when I see them exposed to air, we don't actually see this fleshy material here. I see them covered up. So why is that?
Yeah. Especially that aggregating anemone that you talked about, that often lives very high in the intertidal. So when the tide goes out, it's often exposed to the air for quite a long time. And so what they do, they are basically just bags of water. And if they dry out, that's very bad for them. Right. So what they do is they pull in their tentacles, they sort of pull down tightly, and they often actually also cover their outer surfaces, which you can see on this guy.
Right here.
They attach pebbles or shells. It looks like a mussel shell that's attached there. And they often cover over that whole column really densely with that kind of material. And that presumably slows desiccation, slows drying, also maybe avoids them getting sunburned.
So Bruno, what do these actually anemones feed on, and how do they feed?
These ones in particular feed in two ways. They eat meat, so they're sessile, they don't move around, so they wait for little chunks of meat to fall into them, like if a snail gets dislodged from a rock and falls in, it'll grab it, for example, or a mussel, something like that. And these often also have symbiotic algae that live inside their cells that they use for, that they get photosynthetic products from, so they get energy in two ways.
The relationship between the algae and the sea anemone is a symbiotic relationship in that each species will depend on one another. This particular relationship is mutualistic in that the sea anemone and the algae both benefit from the relationship. The sea anemone uses oxygen and food products produced by the algae, and the algae in return receives protection from predators along with a better chance at receiving sunlight. Sea anemones sometimes have more than one symbiotic relationship at the same time. A great example of this is the relationship clownfish have with sea anemones. The clownfish receives protection from its predators by living in and around the sea anemone. The clownfish have developed immunity to the sea anemone's stinging cells and can freely move around the sea anemone without being stung. Other fish, however, will be stung and consumed by the sea anemone if they come into contact. The sea anemone will benefit from the clownfish as they will actively deter predators that can feed on the sea anemone's tentacles. This type of relationship is typically referred to as commensalism, as a relationship benefits one participant more than the other without harming it. The local sea anemones that are in our tide pools, however, do not have this type of relationship, as there are no clownfish living in our tide pools. So can these anemones, can they move around? Can they walk?
Mm-hmm. They can, just very slowly for the most part. So these can crawl, but we're talking about, maybe a centimeter a day or something like that, not very much. There are some other species actually that can swim. So if a predator comes up, they actually let go of the substratum and swim away in a very sort of undirected fashion. It's pretty fun to watch.
So the reason they would want to move is to maybe get to a better area, possibly.
Sure, yeah. I mean, if they have photosynthetic symbionts, for example, they might want to move to a slightly sunnier area or some such thing, or an area that at low tide has a little bit more water.
Mm-hmm. Why are these browning here?
Well, it's because it actually, so they hold those symbiotic algae, which are single cells, inside of the cells of the sea anemone. And it turns out that if a sea anemone is in the dark and it has some of those symbionts, it actually costs it to maintain those symbionts, but the symbionts aren't giving it anything. So if these have been in dark areas, like these I think were collected from 30 or 40 feet down, where it's not very bright, they actually tend to get rid of their symbionts because they're of no use to them.
So are these algae, what's the actual algae? Are they the photosynthetic algae that create energy, right?
They're called dinoflagellates, or zooxanthellae, sometimes people call them. This kind of anemone is actually really cool. It actually can host two different kinds of algae.
Okay, now earlier we talked about the nematocysts that were here. So what actually is the nematocyst? How do they use them? These
sea anemones have nematocysts all over their bodies, really, inside their stomach and outside on the skin. If you touch a tentacle, it's going to stick to your finger a little bit. Yep, just like that.
Yeah, so I don't feel anything nasty or painful. Right. Why is that?
So what's happening, so a nematocyst is a tiny little organelle within a cell, and it's basically a little harpoon and a thread. So whenever some potential prey item contacts one of these tentacles, it fires this harpoon and this long thread out. And that's what's happening when you're touching this.
Right.
And the thread is kind of sticky, and that's why it's sticking to your hands. But the harpoon is not big enough to get through your skin. Your skin's pretty tough.
Right.
But if you were another sea anemone, for example, or some a sea slug that didn't have a shell or something like that, that harpoon would penetrate your skin and it would leave some toxin in there, and then this would move it to its mouth and swallow it.
Right.
So you're safe.
Wow, I'm saying I'm pretty big. So it could take any animal swimming in this periphery over here. If it gets caught in the animals, it's going to basically sting it. Now, are these nematocysts toxic, you say?
Mm-hmm.
So they
Yep.
can affect the nervous system, prevent them from swimming or things like that?
Yeah, actually what they usually do is deposit toxin right where they hit, and the cells there die. So eventually what's going to happen is if it pulls the animal into the center, it's going to get stung with tons of nematocysts, and then the animal's going to die.
So you mentioned that they feed on snails too, but snails have this really, really harder out shell. So how could it eat a snail or a mussel?
That's a great question, and sometimes it doesn't work. But what they do is they grab it with those tentacles, with those sticky nematocysts that fire, and they swallow it. So it goes into the mouth here, and they have a digestive system, and so it'll be down in there, and they'll secrete enzymes into that space. And if there's a crack in the snail shell, or if there's any little opening, those enzymes will get in and kill it. But some snails, you're right, are really good at pulling back in, and they actually have a little seal on their shell. So some snails can survive in there for days, and then eventually get spit out and crawl away.
So if the anemone can digest the snail, it'll digest the meaty parts in here, and then what does it do with the byproduct extra shell? What does it do?
It only has one way into that digestive system, which is through its mouth. So it spits out anything it can't digest after a while.
Gotcha.